Hey everybody, it's Atheist for the Cause here with another video for you, and this one's about the withdrawal of the Paris Agreement again, but I wanted to take on some of the objections, and so let's take a look at this article from The Verge. It says, Trump used misleading job stats to justify pulling out of Paris Climate Agreement. In his speech today, he referenced 2.7 million lost jobs. Here's why that's wrong. And I just want to say this is a very nuanced debate. It's very complicated. There's a lot to it. So I think it's healthy to have a debate around this and look at both sides and make a determination. And it's based on a lot of projection too. There is no easy answer to this. So anybody who makes you should be skeptical of anybody who makes this seem like there's an easy answer either for staying in or getting out, because there is no easy answer. It says President Trump announced his plans to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement today in a jazz-accompanied spectacle at the Rose Garden. He justified the decision by arguing that the terms of the accord could cost Americans as much as 2.7 million lost jobs by 2025. Of those, he claimed 440,000 would be manufacturing jobs. Believe me, the president said, this is not what we need. But experts say that there are some problems with the way Trump presented those numbers. It's not something you can cite in a presidential speech with a straight face, says Yale economist Kenneth Gillingham. It's been used as a talking point taken out of context. Okay. The source let's look at how it's been taken out of context then. The source for President Trump's numbers is a report by the consulting firm National Economics Research Associates, NERA. The report was commissioned by the American Council for Capital Formation and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, two organizations that the Natural Resources Defense Council has described as unabashed apologists for America's biggest climate polluters. Well, this is more like attacking the credibility. It's not really taking on the policy, and telling us why the policy is wrong or why the talking point is wrong. So just let's put that off on the side, because it doesn't really get us anywhere in the conversation. Let's look at what they're actually saying about the content. NERA modeled what might happen to the economy if the U.S. were to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as promised in the Paris Climate Agreements. It reported that total economy-wide employment losses amount to about 2.7 million in 2025, and that the manufacturing sector alone could potentially lose 440,000 job equivalents. NERA did not respond immediately to an emailed request for comment. Well, they're probably getting overloaded by requests, to be honest. But the model NERA used to come up with those numbers is unrealistically rigid, says Gary Yo, a professor of economics and environmental studies at Wesleyan University. It assumes that businesses wouldn't innovate to keep costs down to the face of new regulations. Okay, about this objection. This is a terrible objection because, in my opinion, because we all know that innovation can come. The innovation can come on fossil fuel side. There's no way to really quantify what these innovations will be. It's kind of hard to just assume innovation will happen. And so, it makes sense for this economic or this environmental study, to be looked at in terms of the technology we have today, and not just assume some innovation. None of the outfits that are modeled, and by the way, just because we got out of the Paris Climate Accord doesn't mean we can't still innovate. It doesn't mean we can't create other environmental treaties. It doesn't mean we can't, improve our, carbon footprint and reduce it in other ways. So there's a lot to this, and people are acting like, oh, if we're not in the Paris Climate Agreement, then we're doing nothing for the environment, and that's just not the case. None of the outfits that are modeled in the model would stay in business in the real economy for more than 10 or 15 years, he says. That's why even massive oil producers like Exxon and Conoco support the Paris Climate Agreement. They're adapting to a changing economy. No, they're in it because they know it's non-binding and they can do what they want. Or they're supporting it because it's non-binding. As a result, 2.7 million lost jobs are probably an extreme and unlikely worst case scenario. After all, the number of because I'm guessing they're saying worst case scenario. They just kind of threw that out there without an explanation, but I'm guessing it's based on this previous paragraph where they're saying, there would be innovation and that kind of stuff. But 2.7 million jobs is a lot. That's over an entire year's worth of jobs. Even if you cut it down to like 1.5 million jobs, 1.5 to 2 million jobs, you're still talking like losing an entire year's, almost around an entire year's worth of jobs for a non-binding agreement. And that doesn't necessarily mean there will be results from other countries. And, is that really worth it? We have multiple interests at stake here. After all, the number of jobs in solar grew by 25% in 2016. Oh, really? Okay. And how many total jobs are there? You didn't mention that, right? Because there aren't actually that many solar jobs. And by 32% in wind. Again, you didn't mention it. And a lot of these jobs are like, I have done some research in the past. I don't have the numbers on me right now, but a lot of these jobs are actually outsourced outside of the country. They're not even necessarily American jobs. In fact, while 1.1 million people work in coal, oil, and gas, there are another 800,000 people whose jobs lie with low carbon emitting technologies like renewables, natural gas, and nuclear power. Okay, so in order for them to make their point that, they're still being outpaced by 300,000 jobs, 1.1 million to 800,000 in the coal, oil, and gas, and they're comparing that to, they're including natural gas and nuclear power as clean energy. So, or as, low carbon emitting technologies. Well, nuclear power has all kinds of waste, and natural gas is basically came out of the gas industry. Put simply, they're not accounting for the jobs in the clean energy economy that are created, Gilliam says. The other problem the study itself acknowledges, and they do have a link to the study if you want to read it. It does not take into account potential benefits from avoiding emissions. The study results, we don't really know what those benefits would be. The study results are not a benefit cost analysis of climate change. This means that the dire numbers aren't being balanced by another model estimating the potential gains to the U.S. economy by preventing climate change. If you assume that there are no benefits and the costs are there, then of course things look bad, Gilliam says. Trump asks us to believe him, but he'll have to stop cherry-picking stats first. Well, I mean, to some extent, this is right. The 2.7 million jobs isn't going to create, like, it's not including innovation that we don't know is going to happen. It's not including, what was it that they just said? The benefits from avoided emissions. But there are things it's not going to include, but like they're not even attempting to tell us what impact that would have, and how would that really change these numbers. So they're just kind of throwing out a bunch of information at us, and this is not really convincing. Like, tell us, why, how big of an impact would the, benefits of avoiding emissions have on jobs. So then we have the MIT issues statement regarding research on Paris Agreement. If you remember, Trump discussed that one of his main talking points, and Scott Pruitt, the EPA administrator, one of their main talking points was that there was a study done by MIT. And of course, MIT issued a statement. It says, a set of talking points circulated in support of President Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement included this statement. The Paris deal also accomplishes little for the climate. According to researchers at MIT, if all member nations met their obligations, the impact on the climate would be negligible. The impacts have been estimated to be likely to reduce global temperature rise by less than 0.2 degrees Celsius in 2100. The researchers in MIT's Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change who led the relevant analysis find the statement to be misleading for two reasons. And their points are actually, I think they are good points that do counter what Trump says to some extent, but within reason, and I'll talk about that in a second. First, the 0.2 degree figure used in the talking point reflects the incremental impact of the Paris Agreement compared with the earlier Copenhagen Agreement. If you instead compare the impact of the Paris Agreement to no climate policy, then the temperature reduction is much larger, on the order of 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, by 2100. This would be a significant reduction in the global temperature rise, though much more is needed if the world is to achieve its goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius or less. So I guess you can take that for what it is. I mean, now, is Trump getting out of the Copenhagen Agreement? Is that attached to the Paris Agreement? That's one thing I'm not quite sure about. They're making it sound like it is, but basically they're saying, with the Paris Agreement and other climate agreements, we can have a 1 degree Celsius drop by 2100. It's not even a drop. It's like slowing the rate at which the globe warms by 1 degree Celsius. And the thing here is, like, okay, even if I give them everything and we assume that Trump would have no climate reduction at all, no climate reduction climate policy at all, which isn't the case, he's still going to have some climate policy. It's still a maximum of 1 degree Celsius, which is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. This is, I mean, we're talking like 80 years from now. This is not a huge, number. So I still think, even if you take this entire argument at face value, Trump has good points that they're not really refuting. I mean, maybe Trump's exaggerating a little bit, but that's as much as I'll give them. Second, the analysis accounts only for countries' pledges under the Paris Agreement, assuming no further strengthening of the commitments in years after 2030. Well, the strengthening of the commitments hasn't happened. Why would we assume that those strengthening, the strengthening of the commitments do happen? So they're trying to argue for things that are hypothetical and may never happen, and they're not giving Trump any, hypotheticals where, there's actually a realistic hypothetical that Trump will get back into the Paris Agreement with a better deal, or he'll create a new climate agreement, as long as European countries are willing to go to the table with them. And there was a question when Scott Pruitt was talking to the media at a press briefing. They asked him, what if the European leaders won't come to the table? And he's like, to negotiate a different deal. And he's like, well, that's on them then. And that's exactly right. If they're not going to be willing to come to the table with the U.S. to come to an agreement on climate, separate from the Paris Agreement, well, that's, then the environmentalists should be attacking the Europeans at that point. It says the Paris Agreement is a milestone of the ongoing UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is committed to ongoing annual meetings to regularly revisit and ratchet up nations' climate goals, making them more ambitious over time. The relevant MIT researcher, this can still happen, and, we'll see with Trump, as I just said, what he does in the future. So this whole paragraph, I just throw it out the window. I don't really see it as relevant to the argument. The relevant MIT researchers believe that the Paris Agreement is an unprecedented and vital effort by nearly 200 countries to respond to the urgent threat of global climate change. After reading this article and after reading the MIT objections, I've come to the conclusion that Trump's looking at this agreement as an economic agreement rather than a environmental agreement makes a lot of sense, and that the motivations for European countries may very well be, and maybe not just European countries, but countries around the globe, may very well be economic, where, the environmental stuff is non-binding, but yet, especially the U.S., countries, but especially the U.S., had to pay all kinds of money, hundreds of billions of dollars, for these non-binding promises. So then we go to, there's another aspect I wanted to talk about, and it's the Paris climate deal was a fraud and a sham until Trump decided to ditch it. When Pruitt, here there's a video where it says Pruitt has nothing to be apologetic about. It's not super relevant, but I want to play it anyways because just kind of show you he's actually a really charismatic talker and to the point, and heck, he could do the press job pretty well, but it's slightly irrelevant, so let's play it.
You have to remember, when it comes to environmental agreements and international agreements with respect to things like the Paris Agreement, is we have nothing to be apologetic about as a country. We have reduced our CO2 footprint to levels of the early 1990s. In fact, from 2000 to 2014, we reduced our carbon footprint by up over 18%. And that's been largely accomplished through innovation and technology, not government mandate. So when we look at issues like this, we are leading with action and not words. I also want to say that exiting Paris does not mean disengagement. In fact, the president said yesterday that Paris represents a bad deal for this country. It doesn't mean that we're not going to continue the discussion, to export our innovation, to export our technology to the rest of the world, to demonstrate how we do it better here. is, I think, a very important message to send. He indicated that he's going to either re-enter Paris or engage in a discussion around a New Deal with a commitment to putting America first.
So there you have it. And if you listen to the press briefing he did, it was not that long, but it was he did a pretty good job. So in expressing his view. So anyways, on to the point that he made a point in that press briefing that there were certain climate or environmentalists that were against the Paris Climate Accord when it was first signed. And I found an article back. I didn't know how true that was or anything, so I looked it up, and it turns out it is true. There's an article talking about it. It says, yet it was only a little more than a year ago that climate scientists and environmentalists were viciously attacking the Paris Agreement itself. The goals were too low to make a difference. There was nothing binding any of the signatories to live up to the promises, and no enforcement mechanism if they didn't. It just kicked the can down the road. Well, guess what? Those are the same objections we're raising today. And those are the objections environmentalists were raising down back then. So James Hansen, the undisputed hero of the climate change movement, I don't know if that's true, but whatever. I'm not going to put too much into that. Called the Paris deal a fraud, really, a fake. It's just worthless words. There's no action, just promises. Well, okay, there you have it. So here's an environmentalist, and I think this is the one that Scott Pruitt actually mentioned in his press briefing, James Hansen. He actually called it a fraud. And a joint letter signed by nearly a dozen top climate scientists said the agreement suffered deadly flaws lying just beneath its veneer of success. These scientists complained that the agreement could actually be counterproductive since it gave the impression that global warming was being dealt with when in fact it wasn't. What did I say in my last videos? You're first of all, they didn't bring it up here, but you're incentivizing countries to sign on and basically sign in bad faith and then take economic advantage of the countries who sign in good faith. And the countries who impose all these regulations on themselves will be economically damaged, and the other countries can pollute away like crazy, and they'll have huge economic advantages. So and here, like, people are, look at how everybody's going crazy over this Paris Climate Agreement. Like, if we don't have this, we don't have a climate, we can't have any environmental protections, is almost what they're making it sound like. And it just really shows that they're depending on the Paris Climate Agreement to change the future, to be that environmental regulation, basically, to solve the environmental issue. And it's just not going to, or there's a good chance that it won't, because of the reasons that were mentioned, where it's non-binding. There's no punishment if these countries don't hit their goals. So a study in the peer-reviewed journal Global Policy said that even if every country lived up to its CO2 emission reduction promises through 2030, the Paris deal would likely reduce global temperature rise about 0.17 degrees Celsius in 2100. So take that for what it is. We discussed that earlier. MIT objects to this, where they say it actually would be a full degree Celsius by 2100, because this is incremental, but it's 0.17 degrees on top of the Copenhagen Agreement. So, but the 0.17 or 0.2 degrees Celsius, it is actually like that is really what the Paris Agreement is doing on top. If you just discuss like being in the Copenhagen Agreement and not in the Paris Agreement, that's the difference. 0.17 degrees Celsius in 80 years. Current climate policy promises will do little to stabilize the climate, and their impact will be undetectable for many decades. The study concluded. I mean, if that doesn't say it, then I don't know what does. Because you can like fudge the numbers or whatever, but it's clear the intention of the study was to say that this Paris Agreement will not have the impact. Kevin Anderson, a climate change professor at the University of Manchester, told the London Independent that the Paris deal was worse than inept and that it risks locking in failure. So, I mean, look at just how many of these there are. Friends of the Earth International labeled it a sham of a deal. Sham, again, the word, that will fail to deliver. Scott Pruitt specifically stated that some of these environmentalists use the word sham and fraud. Politicians say it is a fair and ambitious deal, the group's Dipti Bhatnagar said, yet it is the complete opposite. People are being deceived. That's the worst charge yet. That people are actually being deceived by the Paris Agreement. So there's actually, this is, some solid evidence that environmentalists actually think that, some of them actually think that the climate agreement is counterproductive. New Internationalist magazine said it was a disaster for the world's most vulnerable people. Physics Mark Buchanan, writing in Bloomberg View, called the Paris Agreement an abject failure. Nick Fillmore, in a piece of the left-wing Huffington Post, said the politicians had convinced themselves and the compliant mainstream media that the accord of all 195 countries signed was an amazing breakthrough document. So, the Huffington Post author Nick Fillmore went as far as to attack the mainstream media over covering the Paris Climate Accord agreement as a positive thing. Despite the lofty language and idealistic goals, it is, Fillmore said, totally lacking in legally binding mechanisms that will hold governments to emission limits that will stop global warming from reaching devastatingly high levels. Do you trust the governments of the world to follow through on promises? Is this really what you want in a climate agreement? If you really are an environmentalist and you want the warming of the globe to slow down and maybe stop entirely, is what you want non-binding agreements with really what are likely to be empty promises? That's not what you want. We could go on, but you get the picture. If the climate change threat is real, the Paris deal really was a sham for all the reasons these critics cited. As such, the people who said who should be ashamed of themselves are those who continue to peddle myths about what the Paris deal would have achieved, not the guy who proved how flimsy the agreement actually was. And let's get beyond this. Let's just, keep in mind too. The agreement is likely, it's highly unlikely that every country would hit every goal. And when you're talking about like changes now, small changes that will affect 80 years down the line, you're talking if they fail their goals early, it's going to have a huge impact down the line 80 years from now on how much the warming of the globe was actually slowed down. Because obviously now has more of an impact than something you do, 70 years from now. So, anyways, I just found this interesting. When I looked, at what the objections were to the withdrawal of the Paris Climate Accord, I really couldn't find many good arguments. These are the types of arguments that I'm finding, and I mean, it's all like fear mongering. So, and there isn't anything like any sort of hard. I couldn't find much like hard data against them. Maybe it's out there somewhere. I'll keep looking, and maybe I'll do another one of these. But a lot of these objections are pretty bad, and it just has strengthened my my support for Trump in withdrawing. He promised to do it, and he did it. And I am withholding a little bit because I want to see, what is his long-term environmental plan. I don't want to just start polluting like crazy, because that's harmful in more ways than just, global warming as well. There's all kinds of smog and dirty water and things like that. So I do want environmental protections, but I want, I'm not going to assume that Trump just isn't going to get into any deal, that he's not going to renegotiate back into the Paris Climate Accord. I'm not going to just assume that he's not going to create some other type of environmental protection. So let's give Trump some time and see what he pulls off. This is a huge opportunity for Trump. All right, I'll talk to you guys later.